klinika ya hoekom kan
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dylan Price, and I'll be tonight's facilitator on the webinar. We are just waiting for a couple of more attendees to join, but I'll start with the proceedings as we only have 1 hour. Tonight's webinar is titled The Growth of Cannabis Business in South Africa, Where We Were, Where We Are, and Where We Are Heading, Today's hosts are Tax Consulting South Africa, who are the largest independent tax practice in South Africa with more than 140 professionals. Our co-hosts today are Legalese, a well-known legal agency who are well-renowned and well-respected in the cannabis industry. Today's agenda, we're going to unpack the life cycle of the cannabis industry in South Africa, germination of cannabis prior to 2018, current vegetating state of cannabis, future flowering of cannabis. We're also going to have some closing comments, a Q&A session, and a live poll discussion. On the topic of a live poll, we are going to have our first live poll go up now. It's just a general audience poll, just to help our panelists today get a feel for the audience, so that we know how technical we need to go. Please note that the polls are strictly confidential, and please fire away with your answers so long. One back. Ground rules for tonight's webinar. By default, all attendees' videos are off and mics are muted. All questions must please be submitted in the Q&A section on Zoom. Any technical difficulties must be submitted in the chat section. So please note we can only help you if that's in the chat section. As I mentioned now, there's a live poll going up at the beginning. There are also 3 other polls which we're going to raise at certain intervals just to get some engagement from the audience. We encourage you please to partake, and as I mentioned previously, strict confidentiality applies on the polls with only the overall results unpacked. I, as the facilitator, will use my discretion on unmuting attendees when they raise their question, but typically questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation to not disrupt the flow. However, if the timing of your question is key, then I will then stop the panelists tonight and raise your question. And a question we often get asked in the beginning is, will the presentation be shared afterwards? It will be, as well as next steps and the contact details of our panelists tonight. So your panelists that are discussing the cannabis industry tonight will be John Louis Null, who is an admitted attorney from Tax Consulting South Africa. We also have Brett Polak, who is an admitted attorney and cannabis specialist at Legalese. I can assure you they are experts in their own right, and you are in safe hands tonight. As the slides are shared with everyone afterwards, you are welcome to go and read through their bio to get a bit of a background to who they are. But as I said, you're in very safe hands. Guys, before I hand over to you, I must say I'm quite impressed. We have got a 94% response rate on the first poll, which is quite unheard of in these webinars. But before I hand over, I'll just unpack some of those results quickly so you get a feel for the audience. So we asked, what are your reasons for attending this webinar? 47% of attendees said they are attending for personal purposes to gain further insight into the cannabis business industry in South Africa. 26% said they are actively engaged in the cannabis industry. 12% said they're attending on behalf of the company that's involved in the cannabis industry. A further 24% said they are also fellow attorneys. 3% said they're worried that they may be prosecuted by authorities and need to understand their legal position. And 24% said they are interested in investing in the cannabis industry. So yeah, very nice spread on tonight's audience. But guys, without further ado, I am going to hand over to you. And yeah, all the best. Good luck. Thanks. And for those of you that don't know, John Louis is colloquially known as JL. So I'm going to refer to JL, and Brett will do the same. JL, over to you.
Thanks, Dylan. Much appreciated. Yeah, welcome to all the attendees. And pardon the pun, but cannabis has immensely grown in South Africa for centuries now. And where we're moving is quite exciting. Obviously, if we consider cannabis in South Africa, there's a lot of questions that is left unanswered, and we're sort of not sure where we're going. But the positive thing is that government is making a move, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. In this webinar, we will unpack the growth of cannabis and touch sort of on salient points. If you consider cannabis for the past year and where we are going, there's a lot of detail and I would have to have, well, bread inclusive, we'll have to have all of your time for a week to really touch on every single aspect. So essentially what we're going to discuss during this webinar is the germination of the cannabis business prior to 2008, and sort of cannabis, and specifically why we use the word germination is that it's still on the ground prior to 2018. Then we're going to go over to the current vegetating state of cannabis business in South Africa. And then lastly, the future flowering of cannabis business in South Africa. And just sort of discuss that, where we're going, what is on the cards, what opportunities there are, what strengths is there, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat, obviously. So before we start sort of what has transpired in the courts, etc., it's a good discussion to give a historical context and the era of strict prohibition of cannabis business in South Africa. We're going to look at the roots of cannabis cultivation and the use in South Africa, taking in consideration that we're going to focus just prior to 2018. 2018 is a very important date for this, and we'll further elaborate on that later. And then obviously we're going to discuss the strict prohibition of cannabis in South Africa in terms of the Drugs and Trafficking Act, as well as the Medicine and Related Substance Act. We sort of decided to keep it to these two acts at this instance, just sort of to touch on the misconceptions that there might be and sort of just move forward from there on, which is a good starting point. So if we consider the roots of cannabis growth in South Africa, the Eastern Cape Provincial Government published a document titled The Cannabis in Eastern Cape, a policy discussion document. Now, this was published in 2020. Now, what's quite worthy to note is that the Eastern Cape has long been an important growing area for cannabis in South Africa. And government, albeit provisional government, also noted that Moporo land is part of the Dagga Belt that runs from the Eastern Cape to the KZN. There's also other important traditional growing areas in SA, which includes Mpumalanga and the Limpopo province. But there's something else that sorry, Brett.
If I just, it's such an important historical context discussion that, I mean, if I could just make a point there, I mean, it's an extremely old story, cannabis in South Africa. From more recent anthropological accounts, we're learning that the medicinally and psychoactively rich cannabis strains entered through the southeastern African coast through the Arabian Peninsula as early as 1,000 years ago. And since then, and that's why the Eastern Cape is, of course, an extremely important region, but since then, really, cannabis has been very successfully cultivated, sold, and used all over, as you mentioned, JL and KZN in the Western Cape, Limpopo. And so we obviously have rich bodies of indigenous knowledge all the way since then. And that's because specifically from Central Asia, what Africa and Southeast Africa inherited was a cannabinoid-rich flowers, which contain very rich, the goodies, the THCs, the CBDs, the 140 other cannabinoids that exist in the flowers. And so we therefore have very strong horticultural, ecological, spiritual, medicinal, and drug manufacturing kind of centuries old practices in this country. Whereas in Europe, what they inherited, at least initially, was what we now call conventionally hemp, which are targeted for their fibers, which of course was massive at the time in those regions for papers and ropes and all that kind of thing. And so those were really the strains that initially went over to the so-called global north. I mean, we know that the sails of the imperial ships were made from hemp. The word canvas itself is just a form of the word cannabis. And that I think that people-plant relationship and that vast history, going back as early as 13,000 years ago in China, some accounts, that's when it kind of started in South Africa about 1,000 years ago. So I just thought, yeah, I mean, and then upon, that's what led initially to our initial germination of the industry in South Africa itself.
Yeah, and it's sort of what is nice to note is that government has noted this for many years now, and sort of they're very aware of the industry, if I can call it at this stage, albeit underground in that instance, that they went ahead and did this policy document. So we've known of this for many years, like I said, and which you alluded to. It's only now that it's sort of started to unpack. And I think a big reason of it is sort of what we've considered, and I know one is wary to call it, but it's in terms of the influences of the West, the Eurocentric moral codes, and obviously racism. One can't be ignorant of the fact that South Africa were, for many years, there was apartheid, there were certain legislations, the oppression of certain groups. And sort of the Eastern Cape policy document also alludes to that, sort of to say that the criminal prohibition and the use of trading cannabis was imposed by imperial powers nearly 100 years ago and was based on outdated colonial science.
Exactly.
And this sort of prevented the development of a formal global cannabis industry, if one compares it to coffee, alcohol, and tobacco industries. In terms of this observation, I think it's quite accurate, Brett.
I think so, yeah. I mean, if we look, JL, you know, the story of strict prohibition in South Africa is, in fact, the story of strict prohibition the world over. And I don't think we pay enough attention and appreciate that as much. I mean, we see in quite awesome Netflix documentaries, Greener Pastures and others, that they pinned it to the racist prohibition era of the United States. But in fact, cannabis was first globally controlled in terms of the International Opium Convention in 1925. And the reason that that happened was because South Africa and Egypt, who had already cannabis controls in place since 1870, made sure that it was included. It wasn't, in fact, the infamous Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the DEA, and his racist smear campaign against cannabis because he was heavily invested in the timber industry and was obviously scared that hemp was fast replacing paper, fast replacing timber for paper. It was, in fact, the South African context and that influence that they had in the international conventions that was actually the original reason. So what we learned is that this people-plant relationship that we were talking about, how in the global north they grew hemp, which they just by chance inherited from Central and Northern Asia, whereas in Africa and Southeastern Africa in particular, we inherited the medicinally rich and the intoxicating cannabis, that it was used. This people-plant relationship is kind of critical to understand the initial global prohibition, which is actually largely a South African story. So just to contextualize those exact types of policy kind of statements that we have, you know, it's this explicitly racist endeavor to control in apartheid and prior to apartheid in colonial South Africa, hard laborers who inherited this cannabis with rich cannabinoid profiles and became master cultivators. And it's this rich indigenous and local knowledge that we have that actually was turned against South Africans, local indigenous South Africans. And it was the global north that then began to comply with these racist colonial African policies. So in a sentence, really, it was cannabis itself, the plant and its relationship with its people, was wickedly manipulated as an additional justification, I guess, for white supremacy and colonial domination. So yes, I mean, I agree with you. It's just such a rich context. And I think it's just important that we note really South Africa's contribution to the global strict prohibition era.
Yeah, and sort of what originated out of that, obviously there was different legislations over the years, but if we consider the Drugs Act at this point in time, a drug is defined in the Act as any dependence-producing substance or any dangerous dependence-producing substance or any undesirable dependence-producing substance. An undesirable dependence-producing substance means any substance or any plant from which a substance can be manufactured. Now, obviously, any plant from which a substance can be manufactured, it sort of begs the question. Now, if we look at part 3 of the schedule, which is on the next slide, it specifically notes cannabis, dacha, the whole plant or any portion or product thereof. Now, before we sort of go into depth with section 4B and 5B of the Act, for me, it's sort of, in a sense, quite funny to note that grapes aren't listed. And as you would know, grapes is obviously the base of which brandy is manufactured. And in a sense, one can argue that brandy is an undesirable dependence producing substance. But be it as it may, sort of, this is what the Act is prior to 2018, and that's what we've been dealt with. So if we consider Section 4B, Section 4B of the Drugs Act explicitly states that no person shall use or have in his possession any dangerous dependence-producing substance or any undesirable depending-producing substance, which is arguably dacha or cannabis in that instance. So arguably, to your mind, what does this mean for prior to 2018?
Well, so prior to 2018, it was just, we're talking about strict prohibition here, and the fact that you can see kind of undesirable dependence, the word undesirable, that those underpinnings, we're not going to go back into the racist underpinnings, but you can see it very clearly here, and how they're very clearly targeting the whole plant, and not just the whole plant, it's any portion thereof. So in this instance, we can see that the possession and use in any way, shape, or form of the whole plant, even for hemp, so even for something irrespective of what its end use might be, and that's going to become critical as our market hopefully develops. The end use, we should be regulating the end use, as we'll see later and discuss later. We're talking about a drug. How can a fiber of a plant, you're destroying the flowers even assumably or presumably, how can the fibers of a plant with over thousands of industrial uses come under the form of a drug? It's never going to be ingested by a human being. It's never going to be diverted to the illicit market. So we're talking here about complete and utter prohibition on the use or possession. And as you see with Section 5B, the same thing applies when it comes to dealing, at least then, with dealing in it.
Yeah, so again, Section 5B that deals with the portion of dealing in drugs. Again, dealing in is defined, and this is sort of quite important for our discussion. It includes importation, cultivation, which is sort of very important, collection, manufacture, supply, prescription. And again, Section 5B of the Act prohibits dealing in cannabis in any manner whatsoever, unless, broadly speaking, sanctioned in terms of the Medicines and Related Substance Act. Now, in that instance, what I do understand is that the Director General can issue you with a permit, but there's a lot of shortfalls of this permit in terms of what can be done, etc.
Yes, I think when we look at specifically the Medicines Act and the provisions there, we'll see. But suffice it to say, I think for now that remember, guys, we're in the era of strict prohibition. So we're not in the state that we're presently in now. So in that state, cannabis, as we'll see in the Medicines Act, was a Schedule 7 substance in terms of that act, which means it was completely strictly controlled. And you can see there, for example, in the Section 22A, we're talking again in strict prohibition era, a Schedule 7 and 8 substance can only be permitted and can possessed under very specific circumstances, and a permit to that end, including in the context of research and development, could be granted by the DG, by the Director General of Health. Now, this has since changed, and we'll discuss that. But what happened, it's interesting, I think, to note that as early as 2010, I even got some clients who were quite heavily involved in this big research project, the National Hemp Research Foundation, which came up with quite incredible results about the type of things that we can grow here with cannabis, even as a Schedule 7 substance as it was. And nothing really came. Nothing. Government really didn't do anything with that research in relation to hemp as well. So it wasn't just about at all, in fact, the THCs and psychoactives, because that was all illegal without exception. Possession, as we saw, and dealing in any way, shape, or form. But we were talking about hemp, and unfortunately, we missed an opportunity as early as that in 2010 with these national hemp research projects to kind of boost the economy and to actually legalize hemp as fibers and the herds and the industrial applications as early as that. And so therefore, in that period, again, JL mentioned the date 2018 became quite important because we were still, as recently as that, in an era of complete and utter, I guess, strict prohibition.
So obviously, if one considers Section 4B, 5B, and the Medicines Act, has the era of strict prohibition officially ended in South Africa? And that's sort of an interesting question, because if I consider the amount of attendees that attended, obviously there's a few lawyers, but for the normal layman on street that doesn't deal with law every day, is it to their mind that it has ended or not? So it would be great if all the attendees can quickly answer these questions, and then we can see what the general feeling is.
Thanks, Jal and Brett. I think while everybody is answering, I'll just discuss some of the initial results that we're getting through. We've got about 40% of the votes coming in. We're up to 50. So if we have a look so far, up to 62%. Let's let it get up to about 70 before we unpack a few. Thanks everyone for getting those answers through quite quickly. So guys, we're sitting on around 10% that said yes, the legal position is now clear. We have around 50% that said no, government is required to legalize the use of cannabis. 38%, I'm not sure, there is conflicting information in the media. And then we have 6% whether cannabis is prohibited or not, it does not affect me. So what I'll do is for now, I'll just end the poll and share it for the benefit of the audience. But yeah, the main areas, there's 47% saying no, government is required to legalize it, and 41% said they're not sure. There's so much conflicting information in the media.
I think those are strong, as you're saying, JL, yeah?
Yeah, sorry, and it's quite indicative of sort of the role media plays in terms of cannabis business and sort of the perceptions out there. I do note there's two attendees that's not worried at all, which is great. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see that people know of it, but there's still the uncertainty.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's quite encouraging to see this 47% and this 41% being respectively government is required to legalize the use, and on the other hand, 40%, I'm not sure, there's conflicting information. I think those two are actually the exact answer. So, you know, is the era of strict prohibition over? No, to my mind, it's not. We have come a long way, as we'll discuss, certain massive developments that have happened in the space of private use, so the decriminalized space. But if we're still talking about a space in which something like, as I keep on mentioning, a low-hanging fruit to my mind, the fiber of a plant can't be used because the Drugs Act still anachronistically defines it as an undesirable dependence-producing substance that must be prohibited. So the answer is those are good responses. There is conflicting information out there. We've got a judgment out there that I think we should discuss. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's impressive to see that people are actually engaging with the media online and seeing what's out there.
Yeah, that is so. And before we unpack 2018 and the judgment, what's interesting to note is that despite the strict prohibition of cannabis, the cannabis business industry in South Africa is arguably estimated to be a 20 billion rand industry. And from a tax side of that, that's a lot of money for a revenue point of to contribute to the fiscus. Be it as it may, there's certain subsectors in which you can define cannabis business, which is the medicinal use, adult or private use, often referred to as recreational use. And I know you have sort of a point to make regarding recreational use. And then industrial use, hemp, food and beverage use. Now, if we consider these four subsectors, it's very wide. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities. But sort of what does these subsectors entail if we consider the international market, sort of where they are compared to South Africa in that instance?
Well, I guess, JL, yeah. So, I mean, what we do have, and we'll see again, we do have a fully fleshed out medicinal, it's now regulated in terms of the same medicinal act, the Medicines and Regulated Substances Act 101 of 1965, the Medicines Act. So we do now have, as people would have seen, and we'll discuss, you know, the massive, or at least burgeoning, or budding at least, CBD market in South Africa. We have a number of licensees with the power or license to cultivate and manufacture and variously distribute and supply cannabis products from raw materials on through the product development and value chain stages. And so we are on the beginning of our track with the medicines industry. It is established, but it's not to say it's not fraught with issues, especially as we go forward and how we decide to regulate the plants, the whole plant, the end users. But in any event, we do have a fleshed out and established regulatory framework for it. It's obviously nothing like the likes of which exist in other parts of the world. And we have a very massive question to ask ourselves. In fact, do we want to produce our local medicinal industry for export purposes only? So are we going to be extroverted and try to comply and adopt standards that from the global north, which is already proving a very difficult thing to do? We saw last week Lesotho being the first African country to export medicinal cannabis. We haven't yet in South Africa, notwithstanding the fact that their license is out there. Or do we, on the other hand, want to focus on the local market? Of course, we need to look at both. But for me, we already have we have millions of people who use cannabis medicinally in South Africa. So we need to look at this going forward. And this is kind of a weakness and an opportunity, I think, in the space. And then when it comes to adult or private use, we call it that. We can chat about it in a minute. But we have this judgment, the Prince judgment of 2018, which we'll discuss in a second. So I'm actually not going to give too much away here about it. But when it comes to industrial hemp or industrial uses, what we call hemp, hemp is really, it's one plant, guys. It's cannabis. The hemp is a legal definition for cannabis that contains low THC amounts and is at least normally grown for its fibers and stalks historically. For the industrial uses, the thousands of them that we need to start tapping into. And then the food and beverage use is promised to be, I think, globally the fastest growing market in the world. But in fact, in South Africa, although we see quite a lot of products on the market, we don't have a legal regulatory framework for it. And it depends on which lawyer you ask, but many people argue that they're actually still prohibited if you look at what the Drugs Act still says, and the fact that the Medicines Act doesn't necessarily make specific provision for it, the food and beverage cannabis market. So but these are the sectors that are cropping up on various levels of regulation and size and establishment. And I guess the areas that government is going to look to hone in on going forward.
And I sort of think if one considers the cannabis plant in whole, in South Africa, we can capitalize on all those markets, produce the necessary items, commodities, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I don't know if you mentioned, JL, that I had a kind of an issue with the word recreational, and you're not mistaken. Maybe just quickly, I think like it's not necessarily wrong to call it recreational. It's a personal preference. I think adult use is the better name for the market, which is really just legalized sale of cannabis for consumption, not in the medicinal space. And why recreational, I find to be a bit of a misnomer in South Africa, because it kind of foregoes on this extremely rich history in South Africa that we have of it being used spiritually, culturally, medicinally, and many other ways. And that is a market that if we look at just recreational, about guys wanting to kind of get high after work, as opposed to the rich kind of existence of all these kind of sub markets and peoples in South Africa, we're actually going to miss out on understanding what the local market is. And the fact that it really exists and pumps, albeit illegally. So I think, like, you know, the adult use, as long as you're an adult, people use it for religious purposes, as we see with the first Prince judgment that I think we'll discuss now. So I think, yeah, it's I guess a personal preference, but the adult use, I think, is a more accurate way, and specifically in South Africa, given our history and all of that, to refer to that market as.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So obviously 2018 was a big year for cannabis users and producers in South Africa. There were 3 High Court applications in the Western Cape, whereby the applicant sort of brought an application to declare certain sections of the Drugs Act unconstitutional, and the High Court arguably ruled in their favor. And as law works, that when the High Court does declare a certain section of an act unconstitutional, it gets referred to the Constitutional Court. Now, this is what exactly happened with the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development and others versus Prince. In considering that, when the matter was referred to the Con Court, the state actually opposed the application on that basis of declaring that certain provisions, which we've dealt with, Section 4B and 5B, unconstitutional. Sort of Prince, as an attorney, was one of the case law that we actually studied very early in our careers in terms of freedom of religion, etc., and whether Prince was fit and proper to be enrolled as an attorney on the basis that for religious purposes he would continue using cannabis, and arguably therefore breaking the law. To your, what is important of the Con Court decision that was handed down in your view?
I think JL, and it's great that you mentioned the history of the approach on religious Rastafari grounds to the prohibition against use and possession, because that's what Gareth Prince initially did in the early 2000s, unsuccessfully. Instead, when they returned this time, backed by fantastic lawyers and Fields of Green for all, the juggernauts in the activist space, and Schindler's attorneys, they came on the basis of the right to privacy. So the right to privacy is far more strategic than the right to freedom of religion. Why specifically, at least in this case? Because as important and significant as the Rastafarian community in South Africa is, it's a small population, whereas the right to privacy, the cultural practice and religious practice of using cannabis and ganja is a Rastafarian one, but privacy, anyone can use it. So what essentially the court held, and I think we might look at the order, but was that the government has no legitimate interest. There's no legitimate interest served by the state in interfering in the inner sanctum of our private spaces and stopping us from cultivating and consuming a substance that, relatively speaking, is quite harmless. So if you want to limit a right, if you want to violate a right in the Bill of Rights using legislation, you have to prove that it's justifiable in an open and democratic society. And in this case, the state just couldn't prove that, because there was actually, when you look at all the other harms done by so many other substances out there, the relative harm of cannabis when used in private and small kind of quantities is really, you can't weigh it up enough for the government to step in and regulate people's use at home. And so it actually, as we'll see, it ordered Parliament instead to step in and correct these constitutional defects. But I think before we discuss that, maybe we just look at, I think you said you wanted to discuss the orders the court.
So Bill, if we can go to the next slide. So obviously the order is quite long. It's sort of a page. There's a lot of other aspects. But I think what is quite important is how the ruling of the Constitutional Court sort of made the following three rulings that forms part of the whole order, and whereby the provisions of Section 4B of the Drugs Act are inconsistent with privacy and therefore invalid to the extent that they make the use of possession of cannabis in the private by an adult person for his or own consumption in private a criminal offense. So that was the portion of the possession, etc. Section 5B that dealt, amongst others, with dealing with, where it said that that provision is constitutionally invalid to the extent that they prohibit the cultivation of cannabis by adult in a private place for his or her own personal consumption. Now, if we consider the juxtaposition with the reading of Section 4B and 5B prior to 2018 that we sort of dealt with in the beginning, for me, there's a common denominator in terms of own consumption and private. And it sort of alludes to that fact that government shouldn't interfere with citizens' private doings, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially if you look at what happened with the change for dealing in the applicants, Prince and others in this case, they did ask the court for at the High Court level for a ruling that the prohibition against dealing itself was unconstitutional. They didn't get that. They specifically didn't get that. And what that highlights, in fact, is the right to privacy. So they're not dealing with the right to free occupation by cultivating and, for example, selling. And that when it came to 5B, in terms of the prohibition against dealing, they didn't actually change the prohibition. The prohibition is it is prohibited to deal in any way, shape, or form in an undesirable substance, which, as we saw, through cannabis and the whole plant or any portion thereof. It changed the definition, or into the held that the definition of dealing in was unconstitutional, because as we saw up top, dealing in included cultivating. So you couldn't cultivate. So I think it was just critical. In order to possess and use at home, you have to be able to cultivate or in private. It's not limited to home, as we now know. We've got the burgeoning cannabis club space that we can discuss. But they didn't rule the prohibition of dealing as unconstitutional, and that's critical because we're still in the phase of prohibition, albeit not as strict. And so the Parliament, to the court, then said to Parliament, you guys have 24 months, so 2 years from the date of the judgment, 18 September 2018 to 18 September 2020, to release laws that fix these constitutional defects. And we now, the Parliament has been a bit late, but in September of last year, they did release a bill, Cannabis for Private Purpose Bill, which did not give an inch more than that, i.e. it just really, it has delineated, and we think still in ways that marginalize the cannabis communities heavily, the private cultivation, use and possession of cannabis, and it gives out the quantities and the manner of using them. But I don't know how much detail we're going to go to the bill now, Jay. I'm in your hands, but you know, it sets out a whole bunch of ways that we deal with it. It sets out trafficable quantities. It sets out commercial quantities that are still illegal to hold. And so this is where we are. This bill is, of course, not law. It has to go through the parliamentary process. It's still only with the National Assembly. It still has to be debated there, and then in the National Council of Provinces. We've got a long time before, and hopefully a long time before it's passed, and it hopefully won't be in its present state. But this is, in fact, where we are, at least in relation to cannabis for private purposes. And whether Parliament will decide, and Government will decide, which the cannabis plan, which we'll discuss in a second, to add on to this bill to legalize the market or via other legislative mechanisms, we have to wait and see.
So, following the ruling of the Constitutional Court, there was also a few amendments in the medicinal sector, with the removal of cannabis from schedules, the downscheduling of THC to Schedule 6 with certain exceptions, and CBD to Schedule 4 with certain exceptions. So that's something interesting to note as well. Sort of everyone getting on board of this new movement that we're going, or rather this new phase that we're entering as a country. Obviously, there's a lot of different departments and there's interplay. The master cannabis plan sort of also notes that one single department can't affect all necessary amendments and changes to bills. There's a lot of working that required.
Yes, absolutely, JL. And I think some of these changes were very welcome. We haven't mentioned here our licensing process and SAHPRA, South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. Every South African since COVID knows about, which is actually a wonderful thing. Well, the fact we know about it, and that they're our license regulator, and that they have a website that we can actually learn about these things, and we can. This is how I learned about the medicinal sector in a large part. So check out the SAHPRA website for the medicinal sector, you guys at home. But you know, the removal of cannabis as a plant, the word and everything it implies agriculturally a plant from the Schedule of the Medicines Act was really a massive moment. Happened in 2020. It actually was a hazard to the Ministry of Agriculture, who's supposed to regulate this plant as a plant. You know, the goodies inside the plant, the THCs, the CBDs, 140 other cannabinoids that exist in the plant that are completely under research, are growing very richly in our land in Eastern Cape with our cannabis community, smallholder farmers. But you know, the removal itself, cannabis from the Medicines Act, was a massive moment because it was Schedule 7, as you said. THC itself, which is the intoxicating cannabinoid that gets us high, was downscheduled to Schedule 6. So if it's in a medicine that has been registered with SAHPRA, you can get it on prescription. And the same with certain exceptions. Some of those exceptions are like private use and cultivation as a direct result of the Prince judgment. Of course, there was a new kind of percentage being 0.2% THC. So cannabis with a percentage lower than that of THC is now considered Schedule 0. So that gives way also for the hemp market, because essentially we're growing hemp, either medicinally, whether the stuff you're looking for is in the flowers or in the stalk with low THC to kind of target that whole market. And then those products or raw materials cannot be for human ingestion, which we think is too low. It should be 1%, and we'll see what happens with the Cannabis Master Plan on that. And when it comes to products that are actually for human ingestion, it's got to be 0.001% or less of THC, which is in many ways what kind of ousts the food and beverage market, because these are impossibly low kind of, from a cultivation perspective at least, percentages of THC to obtain. But in the CBD space, and we all know what's happening in the discounts and Clixes and the pop-up shops of this world, we've got lots of CBD and some of it even locally produced, not necessarily, locally produced. And that's because certain preparations of CBD are treated now as Schedule 0 substances. So again, you can buy them from an open shop if they comply with certain thresholds. But again, in this context, processed products, if they're not complementary medicines and health supplements and comply with that whole quite onerous regime of complementary medicines, they're not allowed if processed products with anything more than 0.0075% of CBD. So really all we can sell legally are hemp seeds and hemp seed foods, which are an amazing source of proteins and omegas and etc. And that is the food and beverage kind of what very clearly exists in South Africa. But beyond that, we're in a state, we still, whether it's prohibited or under-regulated, we kind of aren't 100% sure. We have to liaise constantly with SAHPRA to get quite, at times, frustrating responses for our clients. But that's kind of what's happening in the medicinal sector.
So taking in consideration everything that's been discussed, and sort of, I'm not sure how many of the attendees actually read the judgment, but did the ruling of the Constitutional Court decriminalizing the private use of cannabis create more legal certainty or uncertainty for cannabis users and or producers?
Interesting.
Hi guys, so we'll wait again for the results to come in around 65%. Just to note that we've got about 15 minutes left of time. So far, we've got about 53% responses. Thank you to the attendees for being quite quick on this. We're up to 60%. So let's go 35% of the attendees say they have not read the judgment of ConCourt. 38% said yes, the judgment created certainty. And around 30% said no, the judgment created more legal uncertainty as opposed to providing clarity. Thank you all for sending through those answers. I'll share the results for the benefit of the audience. Jael, I'll hand over to you and Brett just to unpack that a bit, but quite an equal split in the three answers there.
Yeah, and again, sort of, and this, it ties in with the possible misconceptions that there's with the use, the private cannabis private use purpose bill, sort of what one can do and what can't do. And again, it ties in sort of, this remains a bill. It's not been legislated at this stage. And obviously in the media has stated a lot of different things regarding the use of cannabis for private use. Brett, to your mind, sort of what are the big misconceptions and the shortfalls of the private use bill? It's sort of clear that it refers to private use, and if we consider the ruling, every time it's private consumption. So arguably, if one considers this, can I then as a producer produce cannabis, for example, for the private use by users?
So yeah, there's a lot I think to unpack in your question there, but I think even just like with relation to the judgment and what it allows, there's a lot of misconception. I think if we look at the judgment, or even just look at the summary on the website of the Constitutional Court, or the link that you previously posted, there's this nice summary. You don't have to read the 100 pages of Judge Zonto's reasoning. You could read like a 2-pager, which will give you enough, which I think is a good idea for anyone interested in the audience. But in terms of the bill, I think and we can talk more about the judgment, and we must talk about cannabis clubs at some point, JL, but you know, the bill itself, the first and biggest misconception, is it is not law. That's the biggest misconception, and like the most important one. This thing is a bill. It's woefully, I think it has woefully not or inadequately considered comments from the public, especially those in our rural small-scale farmer, in Pondoland, in rural Eastern Cape, KZN, even parts of the Western Cape, and as you said, Limpopo. We don't have submissions from them on what should be sufficient. This bill very much, hopefully by the time it's passed, will have taken into account the needs of people who live, for example, in townships who, if I myself am here living by myself, 4 plants growing for my own use, which is what the bill kind of allows, would be more than sufficient. I think my parents would like to think. But for people living in informal settlements, 10 people in a crowded space, you know, we're talking about serious continuous marginalization and criminalization of peoples, instead of actually enabling them to cultivate the plant, even if only for private purposes. I mean, so this, you know, it's fraught with these types of issues, and we could go so much into detail with them at any level, but I think for now it suffices to say that, and maybe that, as you mentioned, JL, no, it doesn't, there's no legalization, there's no provision made for legalization in this bill. The Constitutional Court told Parliament to go and fix the constitutional defects in sections 4B and 5B when it comes to cultivation, to the extent that we cannot privately use, so the decriminalization. Now, whether Parliament, in doing and not giving an inch, we've spoken about the way it continues to marginalize people, that's a side issue, but it's not a side issue, it's a massively important issue. But on the question of what can we now do, and the misconceptions of what we may and may not do, remember, one, this thing is not a law, and it won't be for, at least in my opinion, another 6 months, perhaps even longer. And B, there's no provision made for legalization. It is only decriminalization for private use. So no selling, no distribution. You can give away certain amounts for free, for absolutely no consideration whatsoever, in terms of the bill. But there are lots of misconceptions I guess we could talk about.
Yeah, but it's not all doom. There's government has sort of noted quite interesting points. The global medical cannabis industry is estimated to generate 82 billion by 2027, with the International Monetary Fund indicating that cannabis is the 59th largest economy in the world. And sort of where we're going now with the discussion is the possibilities of the future flowering of cannabis business in South Africa and the prospects that's on the horizon for us. What's interesting to note is that the United Nations estimates that there's a total of 190 million people that are cannabis users compared to 1 billion smokers. So this data was provided by government. So I'm not sure when they said 1 billion smokers if it refers to tobacco users, but be it as it may, I do think that the 190 million is sort of miscued data, in the sense that if one considers Africa, except Lesotho, private use is being criminalized in most countries. So I'm not sure how accurate that data is, and it might be that it's far higher as opposed to smokers. And then, quite interesting, Interpol regards South Africa as the 4th largest producer of cannabis in the world. And this is obviously entirely attributed to the climate and the growing conditions of South Africa. So we have the needs. We just now need to sort of engage, and the fruits are there. We can sort of move forward and capitalize on this market, albeit on a local market. And Cabinet also noted in 2019, and this is probably following the judgment, that South Africa needs a national strategy to commercialize cannabis, to increase economic growth, create jobs, and alleviate poverty. Taking in consideration we're the 4th biggest producer, so it's sort of, we have it. The objective of cabinet in growing green gold on home soil is obviously a workable solution, but it's depend on the correct regulation methodology due to the inequality of the formal and informal sectors of South Africa. Now, regulation is always something that's been close to my heart, and regulation in South Africa has always been a contentious aspect. If we consider credit lending, the credit lending is obviously regulated by the National Credit Act, where South Africa namely has two sectors: the informal sector, which is your stockpiles, etc., more your township sort of economy, and then you've got your registered micro lenders. Now, the big thing with the regulation, it's so strict that it mostly unregulated the informal sector, and there's high barriers imposed on new entrants. And there's a reason why I refer to the National Credit Act. From a legal point of view, the National Credit Act is one of the pieces of legislation that we're still litigating on, not on in terms of offenses, etc., but because of the interpretation. And the National Credit Act has its origin from Canada. Canada is the largest cannabis industry in South Africa. Well, not in South Africa, in the world. And they've got the ball right in terms of what needs to be done. My concern is that should we follow and get inspiration from foreign jurisdictions, Canada, for example, is it then going to be again a question of we've got these foreign principles in the South African legislation that was not written for South Africans? You've mentioned earlier that public participation in terms of the bill was inadequate. And there's a possibility that the regulation might kill the industry. Will it be any different in terms of the cannabis sector, where an application fee alone for obtaining a license for South Africa from the South African Product Regulating Authority is 24,000 Rand? I know you also mentioned that the setup costs are quite high.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. JL correctly mentioned the actual application fee that SAPRA takes for the application for a license to cultivate and produce medicinally containing medicines, cannabis containing medicines, is 24,000. But if you want to invest, if you want a facility that can do it complies with the GMP standards, you need nothing, south of they say between 5, I've seen licenses being granted for facilities in that region, million Rand. So you're already automatically talking about excluding millions of South African farming communities from the space. And is it necessary to do so? Look, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're dealing here we're talking now about medicines at least. And insofar as, regular prescription drug therapeutic medicines are concerned, it's not for nothing that we have extremely important and high and onerous kind of hoops to jump through in that regard, because we're talking about products that can be very harmful if not taken properly, that are promising to do certain things that have to be proven to do so. And so in the medicinal space, it's not to say that we don't need important or onerous regulatory controls. But what we must also be looking at is the local market, because people have and do use cannabis medicinally and have been doing, as we mentioned, for centuries successfully. And also the fact that if we just going to, and as I say, we've been cultivating this very successfully for centuries. And so the market already exists. And so what we need to kind of be doing is regulate the end use, in my opinion. Yeah. And so what I'm seeing in the Cannabis Master Plan, they're kind of traces of it, but we don't really see end use regulation. So to the extent that from an agricultural perspective, anyone can grow it. We've been doing it extremely successfully for 1,000 years. So we just need an enabling piece of legislation that enables both someone who's growing in Mpondo land or anyone else who's growing in a less rural setting with access to land, so that everyone can play the game and make money out of it and do what they've been doing or would like to do, whether you pro capital or pro more social redistribution of wealth. It's irrespective. Everyone can really participate in this game, and it's how we regulate it. If we just adopt a Canadian model with extremely high GMPs, good manufacturing practices and others, we're going to lose out because we're going to miss out on the local industry that already exists and the extremely rich culture and tradition of growing very, very rich cannabinoid containing cannabis in South Africa. I've seen studies that in Pondo land, there's certain strains which are land races. This is another massive challenge, the IP, the biopirates. How are we going to ensure that guys from the global north, the Canadians, which they are doing in certain places, we read about the biopirates coming in, taking intellectual property in the form of land races, things that are common goods to the people. That's been a long fight in itself. And then taking it abroad, making their own strains and selling it back to us. We can't afford to let that happen. We cannot afford to let that happen. So this cannabis master plan has to address that. It has to address our local market, which already exists and thrives. And we have to take lessons from Canada, yes, and Germany and elsewhere about state-of-the-art facilities, but in a way that we can actually grow it ourselves and produce product, develop ourselves.
Yeah, so sort of, you made mention of the National Cannabis Master Plan, and it would be interesting to see how many of the attendees actually has read the master plan or has sight of it. And if they have sight of it, do they think that South Africa is on the right growth path with this master plan?
Thanks, Charles and Brett. So yeah, we'll wait again for us to get around 70%, which we are almost there. Just for those attendees that are still on, we have slightly gone over time, but there's still some great content to get through, plus a Q&A at the end. So I encourage you to remain on for the last few minutes. Just having a look at the live poll. Thank you, everyone. I'll end the poll for now and share the results. So around 58% of the attendees indicated that they have not read the draft Cannabis Master Plan as of yet. 8% said yes, South Africa is on the right path, and another 39% said that government is not addressing the concerns of the cannabis industry.
Okay, great. I mean, it's sort of, I suppose that's where attorneys fit in, and we can have that discussion a bit later, sort of where we're going and sort of assisting clients moving forward with what they want to achieve and so on. So in considering the draft National Cannabis Master Plan, and for the attendees that has not sort of at sight of it, there's a few items that we sort of discussed or identified by doing just a traditional SWOT analysis on the industry, etc., and what the plan addresses and not addresses, and some of the strengths that, and I think that's probably the most important following 2018, is that government is recognizing the importance of the cannabis industry, and it starts to provide certainty for both individuals and corporates, because it does make mention of the different subsectors.
Yes, it does. It does, as you say, specifically the four that we constantly have been mentioning. And the one, it seems, that one of the first pillars of this Cannabis Master Plan, it seems to want to release cannabis from the Drugs Act, which would be a massive win. The challenges to that happening in the interim, it's still potentially long in play, but we need to at least very quickly start using hemp as a product. Look, hemp itself has its limitations when you're talking about small-scale farmers. I think it's a massive opportunity for people who have access to that type of facility and space. But the people who, as we keep on mentioning, the generational cannabis farming communities are generally smallholder farms. And so you aren't producing hemp on a per ton basis. Those I guess people have much more easily ready access to the medicinal and recreational kind of spaces, because you're selling on a per gram basis. And so ultimately, if we regulate the end use of the plants, which, as I said, there are traces of happening in this Cannabis Master Plan, and I'm very hopeful that it's happening. There are pillars in place and timeframes in place for things to happen by 2023. Whether it's going to happen on time, whether it's going to happen exactly in the way that it says it will, I think is definitely not certain, but we know that it's happening. And I think it's massively encouraging that it is happening. And specifically in certain spaces, we're going to see, I think, quite soon, certain markets opening. But from a sustainable perspective, I think our industry will very much depend on the extent to which we can kind of regulate the end use of the plant and allow people to grow it as an agricultural good and sell it depending on what kind of distribution kind of framework we want to have in place. Yeah, sorry, you were going to say.
And that sort of ties in with the weakness of the whole plan, is that, as we've discussed, with the over-regulation of the informal sector that's been growing cannabis for many years now, not sufficient attention to indigenous and local knowledge and seed systems by sort of capitalizing, moving to a capital market, as opposed, again, addressing the needs of the people on the ground. And obviously, as you've mentioned, the plan aims to be implemented by 2023. We've seen, for example, with COVID, Parliament sittings has been sort of done on a Zoom fashion for a period. It was suspended. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID, and obviously government needs to consider these aspects. There is some weaknesses that needs obviously to be addressed, and only time will tell.
Yes, indeed. I mean, yeah, I think yes. I mean, I agree with you completely. I think that we can feel encouraged. At the same time, we do need to exercise our voices. We need to ensure that through your legal and whatever representatives that and that's what we are trying to do, is to ensure that the consultation process is wide and that everyone can in fact play this cannabis game in South Africa. As I say, whether you're looking to make $1 million or $1 billion, or just looking to ensure that you can have a livelihood through this thing, cannabis. It is happening, and there are massive opportunities, I guess, now, but we have to be clever and we have to be very strategic in the way that we want to enter the market, because, one way or the other, cannabis for recreational, as I say, adult use, food and beverage, the industrial and the medicinal is going to be wide open in no more than a few years from now. So we need to think about how we want to participate in this industry. I mean, if we want to be focusing on export markets, I mean, that's okay. But I mean, we're overlooking the massive opportunities, I think, that will exist to grow a local market for and by South Africans. And I think it's the brands that really have that in mind, that look to tap into and genuinely engage with our indigenous knowledge systems, not as a corporatized, not as like a CSI corporate social kind of project, but rather as a brand that really sees in cannabis the potential to heal an incredibly divided country. I think we can actually do something quite wonderful, and unlike already, as I mentioned, like in Lesotho, we saw the first medicinal cannabis being exported to, I think, Europe last week. It's a massive achievement, but at the same time, who's benefiting from it? And I think the story so far in the African markets are that, land is generally bought up from political elites, and licensing systems are in place, and it's just those political elites that are benefiting from it. Whereas in South Africa, we have a seriously meaningful opportunity to transform the entire economy. Economy, and I think that's where we should be looking as industry, as stakeholders, as lawyers, as guys in the audience. And I'd love to talk more about it with anyone interested.
Yeah, it sort of brings us to the next slide. I think you sort of encapsulated the opportunities and threats quite well in your discussion. And sort of this is perhaps the most important slide for me, is where are we going from here on? Obviously, as attorneys, there's a lot of stuff that we need to assist clients on. It's quite apparent that not everyone has read the draft master plan, and it's not expected of them. That's why there's probably attorneys, for example. But in moving forward and to ensure a successful harvest of the green gold that it's sometimes coined, cannabis in the industry, is an important aspect. Because of the uncertainty, which everyone has alluded to, is that there's a lot of risks. These risks include civil and criminal liabilities, be it in the form of social clubs, and we can have a discussion. I think if we discuss social clubs, that would be great, sort of, because it fits in with all these items that we want to discuss, from a criminal side and a civil side, from SARS's side, And then obviously this diversification of your products to avoid a situation that all your plants are in one basket because of the different subsectors where you perhaps solely focus on, let's say, food and beverage, and the regulation for that market takes so long that at the end of the day, you've invested a lot of money, but because of regulation, there's no fruits for you, for your hard labor. And then obviously you need to align your cannabis business with the market opportunity and trends within the confines of the law. And like I said to you, what is important is sort of the current trend of growing clubs. I know you're aware of a case in the Western Cape regarding these growing or cultivation clubs.
Yeah, I think thanks for, the Cannabis Club is, it's a growing phenomenon in South Africa and an important phenomenon. And what it is essentially is the use of the Prince judgment. Now, we've spoken about that as decriminalization is all that we have at the moment for small purposes to be determined by Parliament through the bill. But we already have this right. Now, what's happened is that the Cannabis Club model has grown. And not too long ago, last year, guys in the THC Club, it's called, a play on the word THC, naming it the Hayes Club, were arrested and taken to the Wynberg. And all their, up to, I think it was over R1 million worth of equipment was confiscated. Now, the Cannabis Club model is definitely one of these spaces that is now possible to participate within the market. And in no longer, I think the matter is set down for hearing in, I think it's April now. These guys are going to the High Court to ask for a declaration, basically, that the model that they are implementing of Cannabis Club is actually constitutional. So we're talking, even though we're talking here under the auspices of the future flowering and what is going to happen in terms of the Cannabis Master Plan and fully fleshed out regulations, we already have now, in the present kind of market, quite interesting opportunities to enter into this space, which have obviously promised, depending on what the High Court says, it will be very important, even though they're looking at one specific model of these cannabis clubs. Can you grow on another person's behalf for them to then consume at home is essentially the question the High Court is going to be answering. But hopefully we get a positive answer there, because I think, to my mind, this takes a lot of things, maybe a discussion for later, but you can certainly justify and legitimize these clubs in terms of the Prince judgment itself. But every model would be different. So I think, JL, I don't know if I could talk for hours and hours, guys, about cannabis clubs. I'd love to, but I think maybe, JL, as you moved on to closing comments, I think I'll give it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, Brett, it's sort of quite clear there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think this is where our role to the public sort of fits in. For example, with the cannabis clubs, there's a lot of risks. There is a framework, there is space to operate, but the mere reading of the act might still cause that you fall short of want of compliance. And I think moving forward, a lot of attendees also said they're interested in the process, they're interested in going into cannabis, etc., in the industry, is that the focus should be to get your foundation, your roots, playing on the sort of the plant analogy, is that to get your roots correct, get your roots to the sense that you're compliant with SARS, because of all these different liabilities. The last thing that we sort of want as advisors is that SARS or the National Prosecuting Authority rocking up at your door and saying, hey, sir, madam, you're going to court, you've not complied, you've been opportunistic. And sort of that's where we fit in. And I think the big benefit that we and if I speak of we, tax consulting legalese, is that because we're attorneys, any information that's disclosed to us is privileged. And that sort of gives one the peace of mind about, you know what, I've got this plan, let me go speak to an attorney. Perhaps my plan is completely contrary to the letter of the law, but at least I know it, and it's not someone else, it's not a police officer or a judge that advised me of my ignorance per se. I think that's quite important for me to take away from this whole discussion.
Yeah, I hear you, JL. I think, yeah, I mean, it's, from a strategy perspective too, given the flux that we're in at the moment, although things are extremely exciting in the coming up years, for those who don't want to miss the horse bolting, so to speak, feel free to give us a call and we can assist you try to strategize something. It doesn't have to be anything. From a strategic perspective, I think that's where we love to assist clients more than just giving legal advice. It's to kind of look into what you intend to do, how it might fit into a future framework. And so, that's where I really love to engage guys, to explore more with you, in any kind of capacity. So I look forward to doing that.
Thanks, Brett.
JL, Brett, thank you for that. And I must say thank you to all the attendees. Despite us running over time, we've had hardly any drop-offs. So definitely everybody's extremely engaged. Just before we have one or two final comments, if I can just let the attendees know that off the back of this webinar, the slides will be sent to you. There were some questions around that. And then JL and Brett's contact details will be included as well on that email. So if you do want to have a follow-up chat, follow-up call, then please feel free to do that. And then, I think very positive. We are going to have a follow-up webinar. And JL, Brett, I think we discussed around compliance and next steps and strategy and just building on the good work of this first webinar. So we encourage the attendees after the event to fill in our post-event survey to let us know if you enjoyed the webinar, and then just give us a bit of feedback in terms of what topics you'll like in the follow-up webinar. Perhaps what I can do, we've got two pretty broad questions which I'd like to pose to both of you. The first one came from Yvonne. I applied for and received a hemp research permit last year. I'm uncertain as to the exact regulations and requirements pertaining to it. Also, what exactly is in or out of hemp fiber for industrial purposes? Perhaps your team can clarify.
So sure. I think you said it was Yvonne who asked that question. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think, this is a very, very important question that whenever I kind of meet someone new in this space who tells me they have a license to conduct, you say you have a research permit. It's important that you know that that's what it is. The status of these permits, there's just so much to talk about your case at the moment. But you are, depending on what your permit specifically says, Yvonne, would have to look at it more closely. I can't, without giving proper advice, do so in this kind of forum. But please, feel free to give me a call. I think the question was the splitting of what you can do with the fibers, specifically, Dylan. Am I correct?
Just mention in terms of what is exactly in or out of hemp fiber for industrial purposes. Okay, sorry. So when you're talking about the fibers, as we were discussing earlier, there's the outer fibers and the inner bast, the outer bast fibers and the inner hurds. So you're talking about, depending on what you're specifically asking, you can apply, if you're asking how you might apply it industrially, there are tons of ways you might apply it industrially. The question is whether you may, in terms of your R&D, your research and development purposes, do it and then act commercially on that basis. These are big questions that, I'd love to get into further detail with you on, Yvonne, and it'd be great if you reached out and we could maybe have an exploratory call at some point. Great, great feedback there, Brett. And there are some questions that always you need to look at the facts and take it on a case-by-case basis. Another one, I don't know if this is too broad, but someone just said obviously they're looking to grow and farm on a large scale. And where would one start if you'd want to, from a legal and start a legal and taxable cannabis business? Where do you start? Where's the starting point? I suppose that'll be a discussion between you and JL to have a look at that client's roadmap. But Brett, I don't know if you want to provide a bit of insight into that. Where does one start? Sure. I think basically, if you on a large scale, I heard you say, Dylan. Yes. So you're obviously looking, depending on whether you've done your bio prospecting, where your land is. That's the first thing. You need to, depending on what you
that's the first thing. Do you have good conditions? Because if you don't, then you really and you want to grow on a large scale, then you really need really controlled facilities. And those are expensive. And those are generally in the sphere of kind of medicinal space. And so you really keep on emphasizing the end use. So, but even strategically, what I'd say is that when you're looking from right at the beginning, it's in what game do you want to play? And if you have fantastic outdoor growing conditions, then you might now, because of where we are in the state of flux, even though we know the full legalization is coming, decide to play in perhaps a more modest way. It might be in the decriminalized space of a cannabis club, for example. It might be in another space, the hemp. There's advice out there that one can, in fact, grow hemp commercially. I can't go into detail into that now, but you really need to, I think the most important thing is to understand where you want to be once this game is legalized, and depending on the subsector you want to be in, and then take it from there. And that's also another strategic kind of conversation that I'd love to have with you. But I think give thought a lot to what drives you, what are you passionate about in this industry, and how, and you want to play in one of the subsectors. If you're looking at one of the four for now, think industrial, think food and beverage, think medicinal, think adult use, and then potentially what kind of land you're talking about, and then you kind of have to start having conversations on those bases. But fortunately, this isn't a long enough, private enough forum to do that. Yeah.
Thanks, Brett. That attendee was anonymous, but please, we encourage you to reach out to the team after the event to set up that discussion. Then just a closing question before we end off. In light of the developments across the region, Southern Africa, do you think South Africa is falling behind in terms of commercializing the cannabis industry?
Is that for me? I think I see that from Tsiri, my good friend in Lesotho and colleague, co-cannabis legal specialist, and she's an excellent on the harmonization of the SADC region, and a brilliant Lesotho cannabis legal specialist. So just to say that. But Tsiri, I think yes, in some ways, I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier. We are falling behind. Congrats to Lesotho for the first import abroad. I was of course thinking about you when I heard that news. It is fantastic news. It is also mired in a bit of controversy because, as sometimes we've chatted, who are the ultimate beneficiaries of these monies? Are they foreign investors or locals? These are all relevant questions. But yes, when you're talking about just straight commercialization, I think if it's coming in 2 years, commercialization across all subsectors, then I would say that South Africa potentially isn't at all falling behind in the African continent, right? But we certainly, TD and others in Lesotho and elsewhere, have a far more advanced medicinal space because you guys got off the mark far quicker. You were clever and wise, and you did that properly, and made some amazing, investment partnerships with people from abroad. Let me say it, I'm not against foreign investment, I'm all for it, but it has to also benefit local economies. So I'm saying you guys definitely in Lesotho, for example, got off the mark. I think we're behind the mark in the medicinal space, but I think ultimately that South Africa in the next few years is going to start pushing that boundary. Whether this cannabis master plan will be out in 2023, I doubt it. We're falling behind Latin America, I think for sure. We haven't even spoken for a second about countries like Uruguay, Chile, who are doing very interesting things. And those are very interesting jurisdictions that we should be looking at in the private use space, the recreational spaces, and the adult use space. And so I think they're doing interesting things that we need to look to. So South Africa, I would say, is in a way falling behind. The global north, the Germanys, the Europes, and the Americas and Canadas of this world, we're playing. I think we have to kind of calibrate how we're playing it, and if we're in a race with them or just with ourselves. And I think that's kind of the message I like to drive home. If you're looking at building a local market, then we might not necessarily be asking the question in that way. But thank you, Tsiri, for being here and for asking the question, my friend.
Thanks, Brett. So I think that brings to conclusion our webinar. Jael, Brett, if you maybe have any final comments. I know we've discussed quite a lot. I think there's definitely more than enough interest in terms of having a follow-up webinar and obviously getting that feedback from everyone afterwards on what they'd like to see. But from my perspective, I think very insightful and a very low drop-off rate. And thank you for all the attendees who took the time out to attend tonight. And obviously, thank you to our panel for your time. We do appreciate it. Any other points from your side, guys?
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Yeah, just thanks for all the attendees to attend until now, to listen to me and Brett. And I hope it was insightful. And moving forward, we would like to do this more. This is a great space to be in. And there's a lot of opportunity, as Brett alluded to. And I think really this is our opportunity sort of to create the inclusive economy that we've been trying since 1995. And we can move really forward with this.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I just want to say thanks to you guys, to Dylan and JL, and to the rest of the guys at TC Tax Consulting. I mean, it's, you know, ultimately your webinar co-hosting here. So thank you for all you've done to put it together, and it's been great to do it with you. And here's to many more, in fact.
Cheers. Most welcome. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.
Cheers,
well, have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.